Hi, and welcome to this video on World War II. Today we're going to take a look at important battles of World War II. And before I begin, I should just note that this is not a comprehensive analysis of every battle that took place during the war. That would just be too exhaustive. What we're going to do instead is just take a look at a brief survey of some of the major battles. All right, so we're going to start off in Europe. There are basically two theaters of operation during World War II. One theater of operation is in the South Pacific, the other is in Europe. So, in 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. Essentially what this was his invasion of the Soviet Union. He does this for a couple of reasons, including his hatred of communism, but also in his quest for raw resources such as oil. Let's take a look at a video. Again, what you see here are examples of blitzkrieg or lightning war using air power, mechanization.
Mussolinis zu gehören.
Agrotechnique plus social.
Okay, next I want to take a look at the North African campaign, which lasted essentially from 1940 to 1943. So what this battle was about was essentially the Allies trying to get a foothold into Europe. Europe at the time was referred to as Fortress Europe, as the Germans had an iron fist around the continent that would have to be penetrated in order for the Allies to, of course, conquer Germany. The idea was to essentially attack Fortress Europe through its soft underbelly, which would be through northern Africa into Italy and into the southern portion of Europe. The German commander of the North African Corps was Erwin Rommel, the man that you see here, and Rommel is sometimes referred to as the Desert Fox for his cunning and his expertise in using armor, as you can see here. Most of the North African campaign is characterized by tank battles. Okay, continuing on with our discussion of Europe, we'll talk about the D-Day invasion of June 6, 1944. And what this is essentially the Allied invasion of Fortress Europe through Normandy, France. Let's take a look at a video.
The Atlantic Wall has been penetrated. There, after the first assault, the Allies clung precariously to a few beaches, but now they have a solid foothold on Fortress Europa. Men and material have poured onto the newly won beachheads with every favorable tide, and on some unfavorable ones. The Allied command has announced that the Battle of the Beaches is complete. The tremendous offensive was bitterly contested. The Nazis knew that each passing hour diminished their chances of throwing the Allies back into the sea. But the American, British, and Canadian troops pressed forward firmly onto the soil of France. This was no pushover, driving the Germans back. Some of our troops dropped within yards of the water's edge. There were two enemies, the Germans and the heavy seas. German prisoners were taken almost at once. With beaches free of enemy fire, the Allies streamed heavy equipment ashore. Lumbering bulldozers set about clearing the way for vital air landing strips. The blast of Allied shells left shattered German defenses and many dead German defenders. Survivors were given prompt attention by medical corps men. Some were grateful, many bewildered by the smashing Allied blow.
I should point out that the Supreme Allied Commander of all Allied forces was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, an American general. Dwight Eisenhower will go on later to become President of the United States. In this picture, you can see Dwight Eisenhower addressing members of the 101st Airborne Division as they prepare to descend upon France. Okay. Continuing in our discussion of European battles or European theater of operation, the last battle we'll discuss is the Battle of the Bulge, which took place in December of 1944. Essentially what happened here is the Americans and the Allies break out of France and essentially are closing in on Germany. And the Germans in December of 44 make one last ditch counteroffensive effort, and they are able to push back on the American line, creating a bulge in the line of the Allied powers, hence the name, the Battle of the Bulge. What this battle signifies, though, is the last-ditch effort on part of the Germans to prevent the Allies from attacking the motherland, Germany. Of course, they were not successful. All right, let's turn our attention to the island hopping campaigns of the South Pacific. As I mentioned before, there were two theaters of operation, the South Pacific and Europe. And essentially the mission here is to get close enough to Japan from which to launch air attacks to soften up Japan in preparation for an Allied invasion. And the way to do this is to hop from one island or atoll to the next. And of course the Japanese are going to be spread out throughout the South Pacific, occupying these little islands and atolls and defending them very, very aggressively. Let's take a look at a newsreel concerning the island hopping.
Striking back at the weapon they fear most, the Japs send fighter planes to strafe B-29s dispersed on the airfield at Saipan in the Marianas. The devastating power of the mighty superforts has been felt time and again by Tokyo and other important industrial centers in the Japanese homeland. The enemy goes all out in an endeavor to keep the B-29s grounded. Several superforts are set afire or damaged, but 14 out of 15 Jap raiders, including this one, were shot down. Such raids are to be expected, and the still formidable power of our Saipan-based air forces prepares to retaliate with a vengeance. General Emmett O'Donnell, task force leader, and General Haywood Hansel, commanding the 21st Bomber Command, confer on the raid. Major Morgan of Memphis Belle fame piloted O'Donnell's plane. Following the dauntless Dottie are plenty more of the same stripe, off to show Tokyo that the Jap strafing mission to Saipan was all in vain. Newsreel cameramen and official Air Force photographers caught the takeoff. In tight formation, the great fleet of giant bombers roars toward the Jap capital. Alternating with the 20th Bomber Command in Asia, the 21st strikes from Saipan, delivering the old 1-2 punch at the vital industrial centers of Nippon. Rosie O'Donnell's task force roars over Tokyo itself, vulnerable to the long-range striking power of the super force. On the target, and a load of bombs to batter Jap plane factories, steel mills, docks, and other installations, blasting key objectives that will otherwise prolong the war and cost many American lives. With Tokyo aflame, the super forts head for home, wheeling into a sky that pictures the setting sun of Jap nation.
Okay, the supreme commander of the Army in the South Pacific was none other than Douglas MacArthur. And Douglas MacArthur is going to become a national hero for his service in that theater of operation. Another important battle that I'd like to discuss in the South Pacific is the Battle of Midway, which took place in 1942. And essentially what happens here is the American Navy is able to essentially knock out the Japanese Navy in this fatal battle for the Japanese. And this is going to crush the Japanese Navy throughout the remainder of the war. This is a turning point in terms of the South Pacific battles in World War II. Many of you guys have seen this photograph before. This is a famous picture taken at Mount Suribachi on the tiny atoll of Iwo Jima. This was taken by Joe Rosenthal in 1945. Iwo Jima is, as I mentioned, a tiny little atoll that really has no other significance other than that it is a runway or a place in which the Americans could launch their B-29 attacks that you saw in the previous newsreel. And this is going to put Americans in striking range for B-29 attacks on Japan. Okay, the last major battle that I'd like to discuss of the South Pacific is the Battle of Okinawa. This took place in 1945, and as you guys can see from this map here, this is the Japanese home islands. Okinawa is right here at its southern tip, very, very close to the Japanese mainland. In fact, too close for the Japanese. And what we're going to see happening as the Americans get closer and closer to the Japanese homeland, the Japanese are going to fight even more tenaciously. And it's at this point that we start seeing Japanese kamikazes. A kamikaze is essentially a pilot who is willing to essentially end his own life in the hopes of destroying American ships by flying their planes into ships. And you can see the kamikaze coming right at the ship, and it explodes. Okay, let's take a look at a newsreel from the Battle of Okinawa.
Hill 92 on bloody Okinawa gets a final blasting, and holdout Japs are either dead or, in a few instances, ready to surrender. This NIP first lieutenant chooses the easier way. His surrender paper, dropped behind the lines by Americans, assures him food, water, and medical aid, and he's come to the right place. Humane GIs treat him well, as prescribed by the Geneva Convention for prisoners of war. Very few prisoners have been taken on Okinawa, but here's one who disbelieved the tales of cruel treatment dished out by his superiors and induced hundreds of his comrades to surrender, having talked with them over a loudspeaker. These Signal Corps and Marine Corps pictures show the final collapse of Japanese resistance on the island. False propaganda told these men that Americans would torture and kill them, but they surrendered to a just foe. By realizing the hopelessness of their position and disregarding the admonitions of their emperor, they continue to live, and by laying down their arms, spared the lives of countless Americans.
Now, obviously, this is a news propaganda reel from the United States, and it's going to paint a rather rosy picture of Okinawa, that is, of surrendering Japanese and whatnot. The fact of the matter is, it was an incredibly bloody battle for both the Japanese and for the Americans. Not quite so rosy as the propaganda picture would lead you to believe, but that's what propaganda is. Next, I'd like to talk to you about some of the minority groups that fought in World War II and played pivotal roles. The first one I would like to discuss is the Code Talkers. These are Native Americans who served in World War II, and particularly the use of the Navajo language. And what Code Talkers were able to do is to use their language, that is Navajo, and talk over radios to deliver commands. The reason why this is important is because the Japanese were completely dumbfounded. Because Navajo, of course, is an indigenous language, no one else in the world speaks Navajo except for the few Native Americans who do. and so they were able to use their language and use it for great purpose in the battles in the South Pacific. The next group I'd like to talk about is the 442nd Infantry Unit. This infantry unit was made up completely of Japanese Americans. I'll remind you that Japanese Americans were not treated the best during the World War II era. In fact, many were interred for fear that they were going to be loyal to the emperor and not to the United States. However, what we see happening is many Japanese Americans of fighting age signed up and wanted to prove their loyalty to the United States by serving in its military. The thing about the 442nd is that they were one of the most highly decorated military units in World War II. They fought with bravery and selfless sacrifice. Okay, the next group I want to talk about is the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen, a subject of which a recent movie was recently made, was an all-black combat unit. Essentially, they were pilots who were escorting long-range bombers. And the distinction of the Tuskegee Airmen is the fact that they never lost a single bomber, and like the other units, fought with great bravery and loyalty to the United States. Okay, that's the end of this discussion on World War II battles, and I appreciate you listening.